Hi, I'm Scott. Welcome back to my series on synthesizers. I'm starting with the very simplest synthesizer that I own and working my way up to the most complex. Today, we're on number 3, which is the Roland GAIA SH-01, right here, coming up next. This is the Roland GAIA SH-01. It is a virtual analog synthesizer, so it acts and behaves and is programmed like an analog synthesizer, but it's completely digital. There is no analog electronics in here except for the actual output. It comes from a line of Roland virtual analog synthesizers, starting with the JP8000 in 1996, then the SH-201 in 2006, and then this SH-01 in 2010. It has 64 voices of polyphony. That means you can play up to 64 notes at once. It has 128 patch storage sections. You have 64 preset patches, bank A through H, and then 1 through 8. Those are presets that you cannot change. They come set from the factory, and they're set that way forever. It also has 64 user patches that you can write over with your own patches or load them from a USB key. Looking at the memory architecture diagram that Roland supplies, it looks like you have your 64 preset patches and your 64 user patches, and then 64 more patches that you can store on a USB memory key, just a little flash drive. It looks like from this diagram, you can just pick and choose any patch from the USB memory, load it into the temporary area, which is what you actually hear, or into any one of the user patch sections. That's actually completely wrong. That's not how this works at all. Here's the diagram as I corrected it. Unfortunately, Roland gave this thing a real terrible limitation in that when you store data from the synthesizer into your USB key, it takes all your user patch data and writes it onto the USB key. And when you load it back, it takes the USB key and overwrites all of your user data. And you have it's all or nothing, all 64 patches. So you can't pick and choose which patch you want to load off the USB key. So not only that, you can't select what you're loading from the USB key. You can't name it. There's not a file name. So for each little USB key, you can only store one set of 64 patches, which doesn't take that much space. So if you have a 4 gigabyte key, you're using maybe 256K of it, and that's it. That's all you can use. And if you want 64 more patches, you have to use a separate key. Fortunately, these are dirt cheap, but still, what a stupid decision by Roland. Like with most analog synthesizers, the flow is fairly straightforward. You have your oscillator section here. You create your tone with your waveform, you filter it, you run it through an amplifier envelope, and then you have effects. And it has 3 separate tones or oscillators. But unlike most synthesizers, each tone has its own oscillator, its own filter, and its own amplifier. All 3 of those tones feed into the effects. The effects is common to all 3 tones. Not only that, you have an LFO for each tone, plus a second LFO for each tone that is connected to the mod key. So you have, in effect, 6 LFOs, 3 oscillators, 3 filters, 3 amplifier envelopes, 1 set of effects. So it makes it a fairly powerful synthesizer. You actually get 3 synthesizers in one because you technically could have 3 completely separate tones set up. You can select between them and set maybe one of those a sub-os. You could have a separate tone entirely on here. And within one patch, you can switch between those tones, which makes it fairly powerful. We do have an arpeggiator. And so a lot of synthesizers will have maybe 8 different patterns, up and down, maybe a random, maybe a chord or something. But this one has 64 different arpeggiating patterns. They are preset. You can't edit them or change them, but you do have 64 to pick from. And that's quite an amazing, powerful arpeggiator. We also have a phrase recorder where we can record and loop up to 8 measures of notes, and it also records filter, oscillator changes, all the controls, so you can actually alter the filter throughout your phrase, and that gets recorded as well. All right, so we're going to start with an init patch so we can have a look at the capabilities of the synthesizer. So we'll start with an init patch, very simple sawtooth wave. So let's have a look at the oscillator first. There's a number of different available waveforms for each oscillator. We have sawtooth, square, pulse width modulation, triangle, sine, noise, and a super saw. Let's have a listen to each of those. I'm going to put a key hold on and just press a note so we can hear as I change the different waves. of course, the super saw is Roland's stacked sawtooth. Now, in addition to that, each of the waveforms has two variations. For pulse width, we can adjust the pulse width modulation as well as the duty cycle. We can pitch individual oscillators. A coarse pitch of plus or minus 24 semitones or 2 full octaves, as well as a detune, very fine pitch. We can alter the pitch of the envelope over time with the pitch envelope functionality. Attack and decay, we can alter the envelope depth, both positive and negative. It's another bipolar control. We also have two mod controls. We have oscillator sync. When we use oscillator sync, tone 1 and tone 2 are automatically selected, and we also are defaulted into monophonic mode, unfortunately. That's a Roland limitation. This syncs oscillator 1 to oscillator 2, and we get a classic oscillator sync noise. Ring mod does the same thing with the two same oscillators. Now you notice we have tone select and on buttons over here. This lets us say, okay, we're going to work on tone 1. So when we press tone 1, all these controls for all the LFO, oscillator, filter, amp are applying for tone 1. And the red says we are listening to tone 1. So if I press a key, we're going to hear tone 1. If I switch this to tone 2, now we're hearing tone 2. And so on. If I hit tone 3, we're listening. Now we hear just tone 3. And of course, we can turn all 3 on. Or just 1. We can change the controls to say now we're working on tone 2 or tone 3. So now we're on tone 3, which is currently a sine wave. Let's change that to a supersaw. So now if we listen to tone 3 and tone 1, and tone 2, now we can take something we've done in tone 1 and copy it from 1 to 2. So we don't have to redo all these settings over in order to change the settings for tone 2. We've now copied all these oscillator, filter, amp, LFO settings from tone 1 to tone 2 just by doing that. Tone copy, we go from, to, done. We can also edit more than one tone at once. So if we push 2 at the same time, now any changes I make on this control will actually affect both of these tones. This is really nice if I want to make filter changes maybe to all 3 tones at once, but it doesn't actually affect anything else. It's not changing anything other than what I do. So if I change all 3 of those, and then maybe change the filter cutoff, it changes the filter cutoff for all 3 tones. But all the other parameters remain independent for the individual tones. And speaking of filters, let's look at those next. We have a number of different filters on here, and to demonstrate that, let's change our tone 1 to a noise waveform. That's just white noise, and that way we can really hear what the filter is doing. I'll put the keyhold on. So here's our low pass, where it's passing low frequencies and cutting off the top frequencies. High pass, which does the opposite, passes the high frequencies, but cuts out the lower frequencies. Band pass just passes a small amount of frequencies. And we can adjust how wide those frequencies are with the resonance. Peaking leaves the signal intact, but puts a little bit of boost at the cutoff frequency. And again, resonance adjusts the width of that. Changing the slope to 24 decibels changes the sound completely. Key follow adjusts the effects of the filter depending on where on the keyboard we play. So if we play higher notes, we want the filter to open up higher. Let's switch back to a super saw so we have a nice sound that we can play through this filter and examine the envelopes. So adjusting the filter so that we have a slower attack and a slower release, we adjust the filter envelope upwards. You can hear the filter open and close with each key press. If we move the envelope depth to inverse, we get a much different noise. Of course, the amplifier is just a standard ADSR envelope with an overall level for each tone. So we can adjust the release, the attack, or decay or sustain as needed. We can have both the filter and the amplifier velocity sensitive by pressing the shift button while we adjust the cutoff or the level, which will then make those functions follow the velocity that you hit the keys with. So if you hit the key harder, the filter opens more, or if you hit the key harder, the amplifier lets louder sound through. Another shift function is on the oscillator. If we press the shift button and hold down detune, it changes the panning for that voice. That way, all three voices can actually be panned separately within the stereo spectrum. So let's go back to an init patch, and we will have a look at the LFO section. Now, the LFO alters the pitch, filter, or amp values over time, and it can alter them in various different patterns based on the shape here and the rate by this knob. We can also sync it to tempo sync. So if we have this set up so that it's playing, say, 120 BPM, you can sync the LFO so that your sounds are actually also synced to that same tempo just by pressing that button there. So let's have a listen to what the LFO does. We'll use pitch at first because that makes it most obvious. So you can hear there's a triangle, and there's a sine, triangle, square, sample and hold, and random. Now, the sample and hold is a random, but it holds an individual value for one cycle of the LFO, which you can hear if I slow it down. The difference with random is that it doesn't hold it, it actually just moves around and slides. So we can also change the filter and amplifier. And of course, you can do this both ways. And of course, these are all bipolar. So if I switch back to triangle and we hear this, if I move it to the negative side of the bipolar control, and same goes for filter depth, and amplifier. The fade time is the delay before the LFO engages. Normally we'd use that for a tremolo. So if we switch up to, say, sine, and we'll put in a little bit of pitch, and then we'll put a fade time in of a few seconds. If the fade time is off, as soon as I play notes, you're going to hear it alter the pitch with the LFO. Now if I put the fade time up, you hear it waits a few seconds before it starts modulating the pitch, which kind of gives you a tremolo effect. We can also alter the LFO panning by pressing down the shift key and moving the amp depth. And as you can hear, it's actually panning it left and right. And you can do a combination of regular amplifying as well as the panning. All right, let's have a look at the effects. The effects are good. They're not great, but they're definitely good for what you need to use. If you were going to have more complex effects, you'd want to use a pedal or perhaps the effects built into your DAW. We have 4 different categories of effects. We have distortion, flangers, delays, and reverbs. Out of each of these, we can pick whichever one of these ones we want. So we can pick 1 distortion, 1 flanger, 1 delay, and 1 reverb. There's only 1 reverb. On top of that, we also have a low boost, which just boosts the lower frequencies. So the distortion, we can just pick one, and that's the first one here. As soon as we do that, you can see we select distortion up here, and that means these 2 controls now affect the distortion that we're altering here. So this one alters the type of distortion or other qualities about the distortion, and this is the overall level that we're going to apply. And of course, with the distortion, once you start playing more than 1 note is when it really starts coming through. Fuzz. And bit crash, which kind of just takes it and runs it as if it was through a low quantized digital system. Gives you kind of a lo-fi effect. A lot of these effects also have secondary controls. If you hold down Shift and move the knobs, you get additional parameters that you can change for each of these. I won't go over them all because there's just too many, but you can read it in the manual. We have a flanger. Let's turn off our distortion, and next we have flangers. We have a phaser. And we have a pitch shifter. That's actually kind of useful because we have a full octave up and octave down that we can shift that pitch, as you can hear. By using that, we can actually gain, in effect, a second sub-oscillator under each tone that we're playing. Or you can set it up to play chords. Next we have delay. A simple, straightforward delay. And then a panning delay, which is their name for a ping pong delay. And of course, you can also, just like the LFO, you can tempo sync the delay. Lastly, we have a reverb. And as you can see in the diagram here, the signal moves from left to right. So if we add some distortion and then a, say, phaser, and then we'll put in a ping pong delay and then reverb, so we'll get this, and then we delay this, and then we put reverb on all of that with the end result like this. Or you can just bypass altogether. I wasn't really going to talk about this, but you can plug in a cell phone or something in here and just play music, and you can then adjust the level of the input. So you maybe play a backing track. It has a little whiz-bang function here where you can remove anything from the center. So if you have like vocals on a track and the vocals are centered in the middle of the track, you can change the type, and this will purport to actually remove the vocals out of the track. It doesn't really work that great, but you can use it there if you want. You can also just mute the input if you don't want to just change the level. Next, we have the phrase recorder. We will hit Shift and record to wipe that out. And what we're going to do is we'll hit record and select how many measures we want to record. We'll say 1. And then to start recording, we're going to hit play. We'll get a count in. that annoying metronome we can turn off. And you notice as we change things, the knobs actually get recorded as part of the sequence. And then, of course, we can just play that back. There's 8 phrases that you can store, and phrases can be associated with individual patches. Over on the left, we have the D-beam controller. It's a little infrared sensor that you can change, make it change the pitch. Or the volume. Or we can assign it something. So let's say we want to assign it to the filter cutoff. So I'll press that, twist the cutoff knob, and now so that's kind of a neat little toy. Here's the tempo that we can use to tap, and we tap that to change the tempo. Key hold just makes it so you press a key and it stays down. Mono changes it into monophonic mode. Portamento, it just slides between notes. We can change the amount of time it takes to do that by pressing and holding that portamento, pressing it up, and then we can change up to 8 on here. So if I go to portamento up and then press 5, it takes longer. But if I do portamento up and then 2, so you can hear the difference. We can change the octave that we're playing. And you can also transpose semitones up and down. A couple other small little items. It does have a patch hold function where you can have it set to one patch and play a note. And then when you switch to another one, it will hold that previous patch until you start playing the new one. However, it's not great because when you actually switch patches, the sound cuts out just for a second. So that's kind of a really useless feature to me. That's why I have it turned off on mine. Velocity, it has velocity on the keyboard. Obviously, most synthesizers do, but for some unknown reason, Roland defaults it to off, and you have to go through an obscure shift function to actually turn it back on. And velocity can be set for individual patches how you like. And one last weird thing about this is that it has a general MIDI engine in it. So if you send it tones over MIDI, it will actually play PCM general MIDI tones, which is pretty obscure and obsolete nowadays. And not only that, you can access, I guess what Roland decided are the 8 greatest sampled sounds of all time, and they're kind of hidden. If you press preset and hold down one of the patch numbers, you get a pipe organ, some violins, trumpets, a cello, trumpet, saxophone, some weird do voices, and a choir. Why that's in there, I have no idea. It's a great little synthesizer. It's small. You can actually run it on batteries. It'll take 8 AA batteries, and you can run it that way for about 5 hours. It's light, it's compact, and it's great for carrying around. And if you were going to be playing live, it's more than capable of producing pretty much anything you need to do for live music in terms of a synthesizer sound. That said, the preset patches that it comes with, the 64 preset patches that you can't change, are atrocious. They're just the worst presets I've ever heard in a synthesizer. And people get this thing and they don't know about how to do all the programming, and all they do is they start punching through the presets and they're like, oh my God, these are terrible. Okay, there's a bass. Let's have a look at just a few of the presets. Okay, there's a usable bass, I suppose. A lot of these are like EDM trance kind of things, and all right, so I guess that's good for one song. Let's see, what do we have? A bandpass. All right, that's kind of a neat sound, and then there's a kind of a neat sounding arpeggio. But these are not really sounds that are showing off the capabilities of this synthesizer, and most of them aren't even using all the tones. So why did they waste so much space on these presets that are just so terrible? That said, I bought this from Sweetwater, and when you buy from Sweetwater, the sound design genius there, Daniel Fisher, has produced a 64 patch bank of patches that they send for free along on a little USB key, and you can load those into your user patches. And some of those I've actually got in here, and Daniel he's been doing sound design on synthesizers since before a lot of you were born. And he worked for Kurzweil doing sound design, and he really knows his stuff. So some of these are just fantastic sounding sounds, and he's done a lot of sounds that are really great for like a classic rock band. If you just need a synthesizer to do backup for classic rock, a lot of his sounds are right there. I know you're going to recognize some of these. Or something like that. I don't know the song, but you know the sound. Or how about this one? He's done a really good job on several different organs. Or if you're just looking for some crazy sound effect noises, he's got those too. But overall, what the synthesizer is really great for is sound design, because everything is right there in front of you. You got 3 voices, 3 oscillators, 3 LFOs, 3 filters, 3 amplifiers, and you can just go wild on all these sliders and just play and move the sliders and hear what you're doing and just create sounds. And this thing is so much fun to just sit with and make sounds. That's originally what I got for. I originally got this because it was small and compact and I could take it out and use it in live situations, or just take it places with me if I just wanted to take something to practice with. But I end up, every time I turn it on and start playing with it, I end up just losing myself for hours just playing around and coming up with sounds. And that's what this is really great at. So who is this synthesizer for? Well, it's great for somebody who wants to go out and play live, but it's also really good for beginners. If you are new to sound design or synthesizers and things like oscillators and LFOs and filters and are all brand new to you, this is ideal for learning on, because it's all right there at your fingertips. There's no menus, and you can just, by pushing these sliders around, you really get instant feedback as to what you're doing. And pretty much any sound that you can design on an analog synthesizer, you can get out of this thing. Okay, so I do like the synthesizer. I find myself using it occasionally in recordings when I know that there's a sound I want. I just want to get to it quickly. I can usually bring it up here fairly quickly, and then I've got it, and I can play it really quick and MIDI it into my DAW and get the sound that I want. Things I don't like. As you may have noticed, there is no menu on here. There's no display. So no menu diving, which is great. However, there are some complex functions in here that are obscure. And what that means is there's a lot of shift functions. If I want to reset, if I want to go to an init patch, I know it's shift right. Okay, that's really not intuitive. I simply know that because I've used it so many times, but there's so many of these shift functions, and some of them, you press Shift V-Link. Oh, and I didn't talk about V-Link. V-Link is this Roland system where you could have music that automatically plays video that's synchronized to the music. Kind of looks like this. Anyway, it's obsolete. It's abandoned. They don't use it, but it still has a V-Link button doesn't do anything anymore. However, when you press Shift V-Link, that's your menu mode. That's when you start going in and changing MIDI settings and all this stuff. And how you do that is really obscure. And I actually write myself a cheat sheet because I never remember all the stupid shift functions. If you want to change the velocity, you have to press Shift and key hold. If you want to change the sensitivity of the D-beam, you hold down Effects Assign and press one of the number keys from 1 to 8. You want to turn power save mode on and off. Do you want to change the mod speed and depth? There's a lot of functions like that where they're just not intuitive, and you have to have the manual or a cheat sheet like I made myself here in order to remember how to work the thing. And of course, if you step away for a few weeks and you come back, you're not going to remember all those obscure shift functions, and so you're going to need a cheat sheet. Another disadvantage, there is no way of knowing what these settings are for individual patches. So if you have a patch that you made or you want to look at one of the preset patches, as soon as you select that and then you move one of these sliders, you have no way of knowing where it should be in order for that patch to work. There's no display that says, hey, when I hit this patch, here's what all those settings are for that patch. You can't do that. There's no way to know. Some other synthesizers that have a display, you can press Shift and move it, and it'll say, here's what the original setting was, so that you can kind of deconstruct patches. There's no way to do that with this one. So you're kind of on your own when you're creating patches. It's better to try to create your own patches, get it to where you want, and save it, rather than try to deconstruct existing patches to see how they did it, because there's not really a great way of doing that on the synthesizer. That said, you can do it with software. There was a Roland software package that worked with the SH-01 that let you do all that kind of thing. You could do patch storage, you could do visual and editing and so on. And Roland discontinued it. They still sell the keyboard, but they don't sell the software, and you can't get it anywhere. Of course, the aftermarket stepped up, and there is an aftermarket editor that looks like this. And it allows you to easily see the current settings of any of the patches. You can select patches. You can load patches in and out of the keyboard. It works as a VST within your DAW as well, so that you can have your DAW automate some of the functions. So if you wanted to automate a filter cutoff, you can do that inside your DAW as part of your DAW track. You can pull up any of the patches that are in here, and it will actually display on this software exactly how that patch was constructed. So that's maybe educational if you have a computer and you want to learn how patches are made. That will help you out. That said, would I recommend this? Well, obviously, I bought it. I use it. I like it. I wouldn't sell it. It's not that complex to work. Like I said, it's only number 3 on my list. So it's a fairly simple synthesizer to use and to work, to program, to play. If you are a beginner, no-brainer. This is a great synthesizer for you. In fact, Sweetwater teaches classes in synthesis, and for their introduction to synthesis classes, they actually use this synthesizer. And this is one of their best-selling synthesizers. People buy these like crazy. So it is a great synth. It's inexpensive. It's very capable. It sounds good. It's not great sounding. It doesn't have amazing filters in it. It doesn't have analog modeled filters after some famous Moog ladder filter or something. It's got its own version of the ladder filters, and they're not, analog, juicy, creamy filters like you're going to find on high-end analog synthesizers, but it sounds good. And you can get a lot of good sounds out of it, including sounds like you heard from Daniel Fisher's package, where there's all kinds of 70s rock sounds and classic synthesizer sounds, which this thing excels at. Anyway, I hope that gives you a little bit of background and detail on this synthesizer and gives you an idea of whether it might be something you might want to purchase for yourself. If you like what you saw here today, please go ahead, hit subscribe, click that little bell, and hey, leave us a comment and let us know, did you like what you saw here? What would you like to see different? If you have any questions that maybe I didn't answer, or a comment, something I got wrong, known to happen, please go ahead and leave a comment, and check back and see what we post next, because we got number 4 coming up very soon. Thanks for watching.